Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to this week's Q&A. I wanted to do this one a day early as well just because I just got back from the West Coast. I landed this morning, so I'm still a little bit out of it, but the whole trip is still really fresh in my mind, so I wanted to do a Patreon update of all the cool stuff that happened, but then I thought, well, why don't I just do everything? Why don't I do the Q&A and the update at the same time? So here we go, I guess. I was able to, last week, go out to Chicago and meet Super G for an in-person interview. That might be up by the time this airs. I'm not really sure. I had some audio issues I had to fix with that, but Hanadi's awesome. I've known him for years. We did, we worked together on one of the distributions, so it was very cool getting to hang out and finally interview him. I got to hang out with him in New York a while back, but he was on a family vacation, so I didn't want to bug him. I had no problem bugging him this time, though, and it was a cool interview. Also, Dan, Citrus 3000 PSI, and Steve were there. We met up at Steve's office and did a bunch of work on a Dreamcast video. Well, actually, we were all kind of working on different Dreamcast-y things, but the stuff that they helped me with was getting footage for a video that I hope to have done in a few days. It really is just a matter of, if I could set the time to do it and didn't make any big mistakes or anything. But just a fun, hardware tips and tricks video, but I want to make a nice looking one. So luckily the last few pieces of the puzzle were right there at Steve's office with Dan helping, so that's pretty exciting. I also get to see the Dreamcast HDMI in action, and it looked really cool. People are going to be very excited about that. Then I ended up going out to the West Coast to visit my brother, and we stopped at Super Arcade, which was very cool. It was more of a traditional arcade, so you still need quarters or tokens and stuff. It wasn't a free play. But, there's really advantages to both styles, free play rooms versus quarters. So overall, I thought it was very cool. And some of the CRTs they had looked brand spanking new. I was really impressed. Not all of them, of course. Every machine can't be perfect, but it was pretty neat. And they had some of those machines that had it was a stand-up. Let me know if anybody remembers the actual name for these, but it was a stand-up arcade stick, so like a two-player stick on a pedestal, and then space, and then a big CRT in front, like 36 inches or something. I remember seeing those at the FYE in my local mall, but I don't really remember if they had a specific name for them other than a different style of arcade, but that was pretty neat. And then I went over to Vegas to meet up with Jimmy Hoppa. I was originally planning on meeting him in Portland for the Retro Gaming Expo there, but my schedule got all turned around, so we ended up just hanging out on Fremont Street all day. And that dude is awesome. He was even more fun in person than he was during the interview. And he waited till the end of the day when I was many beers deep, and he handed me one of those, one of these god-awful scalers that adds 5 to 7 frames of lag. So I was laughing really, really hard when he pulled that out of nowhere. But it was an awesome day. And strangely enough, I know this isn't retro gaming related, but I'm getting to the airport. I'm like, all right, I get time for one beer, and then I'll get on the red eye home. And then I ran into AJ, my friend, and one of my favorite from one of my favorite bands too. He's the guitarist, rhythm guitarist. So that was a cool little surprise at the end. I don't know if you guys could hear that, but I think somebody's hammering right above me now. So I'm sorry if that spills over into this Q&A, but hopefully it won't be too bad. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to give everybody a quick update of the trip because, as always, I barely had any time to do anything, and I had to jam everything I needed to do into into just a few short hours of time. But I always love hanging out, seeing new retro gaming people, meeting old friends, and just having a great time with stuff like that. So hopefully I'll get to do a lot more trips like that in the future. There's so much to see, and there's so many people to meet and connections to make, meaning, connecting different people together that might be able to work well. And, I really, I'm going to also try to find a way to showcase a lot more of the behind the scenes stuff I do, because I don't, a lot of it, if I were to make a video on it or an update, it would just sound like I'm bragging about all the cool kids I get to hang out with. So if anybody has any ideas on that, I would love to keep everybody in the loop of the other stuff that I do. I just don't want to bore anybody to death. I also don't want to sound like I'm bragging about, hanging out with the cool kids. And I also can't really let some secrets out because I always make sure to keep my mouth shut so I don't spoil anybody's project or big reveal. But if anybody has any suggestions on that, I would love to, at the very least, bring all of the Patreons in on the behind-the-scenes stuff that I do. and maybe, maybe integrate it somewhere else on the site. But I think many of you would probably be pretty interested in some of the things I get to see, even if it's just like a boring, like, hey, look what we learned type of thing. But, as always, I just really want to do what you guys prefer. So comment down below on the Patreon page if you have any thoughts. All right, enough with my rambling. Let's jump into the Q&As, and I'll start from the bottom. Evan McGid said that he recently got his Genesis Model 1 modded with Voltar's RGB bypass board and was surprised that it still had jail bars. Here's what we're starting to find, and it's been a little bit strange and kind of frustrating. But for Genesis 2 and 3s, doing the full bypass and lifting the RGB pins off of the motherboard produces a pretty much flawless image, or at least in my opinion as good as you're ever going to get on a Genesis, until of course the Mega SG comes out. But with Genesis 1 models, it was very weird. So I guess a good example is a VA2 that I had. I did some tests and some captures with it as is, just a stock Genesis, and of course it looked awful. I lifted the subcarrier pin, and it looked much better. Still had jail bars, but they were kind of soft, and the image looked, it was an improvement. Then I did a full RGB bypass by lifting the RGB pins, and strangely enough, I also lifted the sync pin, and that killed the Genesis from working. I had to put the sync pin back down. I guess there are certain model revisions that you can't lift the sync pin, whatever. But either way, I lifted RGB and I put it through Voltar's board, and it looked terrible. So then I thought, well, maybe I built Zach's board wrong. Maybe I soldered it together wrong or something. So then I threw in one of the arcade TV boards, Alex's boards from a few years ago, just to see, and it did the same thing. So then I thought, all right, one more quick test. I know it's really bad to do this, but I hooked the RGB output of the Genesis, the RGB cable, directly to the RGB pins on the VDP. So you're never supposed to do that. It puts too much, sorry, I don't know what that was. It puts too much of a load on the chip in itself, but I wanted to do it just for testing. And when I did that, obviously it was dim, but when you brightened it up and zoomed in, the jail bars were still there. So what I think is happening is on certain motherboard revisions of the Genesis, there's just interference coming from the VDP chip itself. I don't know why, I'll get back to that in a second, but when you lift the subcarrier, it's still a soft, not perfect signal traveling across the board, which is why it almost looks better than a full bypass, because when you do a full bypass, it's a sharp, crisp image, and that highlights everything that's wrong with it, everything that's right with it and wrong with it. So if there's jail bars coming without any part of the circuit, it's probably something in the chip. So Zach spent hours with me over Skype working on this. Jose has been doing just as much work as well on his own to try to think, all right, well, where is it coming from? So we tried lifting the pixel clock carrier off of the Z80, and I'm getting a little technical here, so bear with me. But basically, we lifted pins on something that could cause interference, and then used a shielded, grounded cable to run it around the motherboard back to the VDP. Nothing. We added capacitors to the RAM chips in case it was digital RAM interference. Nothing. Tried doing the bypass board from different ground points to make sure it's the correct rail that you're using. Nothing. No change. So I guess this was a really long way of saying we haven't figured out what's going on with Genesis 1s yet, but we're still working on it, and we're spending a tremendous amount of time on it. The one thing that's there's got to be something weird in this, though, because I was talking to the same person you were speaking with, Ben from iFix Retro, and he said one model Genesis revision that he did still had jail bars, and I have the same model that does not. So I don't know where the drop-off is, but I'm going to check and recheck everything and get back on this. I have a bunch of other stuff I have to finish before I jump back into the Genesis stuff, because it's really time consuming. It's not a matter of like probe some stuff and figure it out. Every time I sit down and mess with Genesis stuff, it's hours, and there's other stuff I gotta get out too. So my advice for anybody, if you have a Genesis 2 or 3, do the triple bypass. The boards will be available pretty soon. I don't know if I'm not supposed to say from who, but there's at least 2 companies, probably 3, about to sell them. I would just do that. And the triple bypass installation is a little more complicated because you have to tap into the audio lines, but I'm also working on getting the documentation ready for that so that you'll have, at the very least, you'll have a basic guide and then pictures that show where you could tap the different points from, which isn't as nice as walking you through step by step, but at least it's something, at least it's something to start with that I could give. As for Genesis 1 consoles, we will figure it out eventually. So for now, maybe just lift the subcarrier and deal with a less than perfect image. And if you've already done the bypass on it, I would just hold off because we're definitely going to come up with some kind of solution. It really is just a matter of how complicated and how much of a difference it makes. So it was a little depressing because obviously Genesis 1 is my favorite model just because I think it looks cool. But I'll absolutely definitely have a fix for it at some point. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get this information out sooner because the more the equipment that we use to test improves, the more we're finding things we've never found before. So like when I did the original Genesis bypass testing, I wasn't using a capture card that could do the full RGB color range. I don't think I had the OSSC at that point. So there's a lot of different factors involved in that. But and also I've heard a few people do tweaks with the OSSC to remove the jail bars. So we'll figure all this stuff out. I'm sorry for ranting for 6 minutes here, but it's something that's really bugged the hell out of me because I want to fix this so badly. But we're at the mercy of time and just continuous testing. So sorry for the long rant, but and I'm sorry that you paid to have your Genesis done and it's not how you'd hoped. But we're getting there, and sadly with stuff like this, we're kind of all in this together. The importer was asking about somebody making a working SNES core for the Mr. FPGA, and somebody did. J.W. Donnell on the forums, who had worked on the other FPGA SNES project that never was released, he showed it working on the DE10 Nano, the same root of the Mr. So it's there and it's working. I just don't think he has any solid plans on how he wants to distribute it. I really hope he just releases it and has a PayPal download button or something, or maybe starts a Patreon and have people contribute that way. In fact, I should probably just email him about that and ask. But I think he's really just wanting to get some money back for his time investment, which I completely and totally respect that. But with the Super NT released and how pretty amazing it is, I'm not sure exactly what he would be expecting. So I'll try and remember to email him and ask. He seemed very nice the few times I've exchanged emails with him, so hopefully I could just have an open conversation about it. And you also asked, what about CD emulation for Sega CD and PC Engine CD? Now, I'm kind of a little bit talking out my ass here, but from what I remember talking to all these other developers, PC Engine CD should be doable. The optical drive-in emulation is something that's been done twice now with the Upper Graphics and the SSDS3. So it's something that at least it's been done by 2 completely different sources. So it's definitely going to be possible. I just can't even imagine a timetable. But for the Sega CD, that's a lot more complicated because I believe the PC Engine CD is mostly just a way to interface the data from the CD onto the same console, essentially. Same with the Jaguar. Whereas the Sega CD has its own processing chips as well as reading data from it. So you would need to both make the optical drive emulator and FPGA emulation of the chips. So I believe that's why Kevtris didn't integrate that in the Mega SG, and that's why you need to get a Sega CD along with that. So I think at this point it's just a matter of time before we get all this stuff, and I really hope that I just really hope this is something that never falls off. I hope, even if it grows slowly, I just hope more people jump on and help in any way they can. And some people, I know at least, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but for me personally, sometimes I do get a little intimidated when I'm working with super smart people that I can't keep up with. But you could still contribute in many other ways. Anything from file organization to making data sheets and guides to artwork if you're an artist. So if anybody wants to contribute to the project, I think Renee opened up a Discord channel to talk about it. And Smoke Monster still has the one on his. They're not like competing or anything. I think when Renee opened up his channel, he just didn't want to. He didn't want to tell everybody go to Smoke Monster's Patreon. You know what I mean? He didn't feel right or it felt like stepping on toes. So he just, he meant it in a nice way. I don't know why I'm over-explaining that, but I would just go to those if anybody wants to contribute in any way that they can. And let's just keep this project going as long and as in-depth as we can, because it might take years to get Sega CD finished, but, I mean, it'd be really freaking cool if it did, right? Especially if we had things like toggleable options, so you could like instant loading or emulate it exactly the way it was for speedruns or something like that. I would love to have instant loading on Sega CD games. But anyway, so yeah, I think I covered all your questions. Next is a question about what programmer to use to flash certain GC video solutions like the Carby. And I actually just did that. Well, Steve did that when I was hanging out with him on Saturday. I asked him to, or I just instant messaged him and asked him to send me the link of the exact one he used. I also got a recommendation from Insurrection themselves, as well as found one similar, but it's not the $5 programmer that you can get. It's the more expensive one. And I think that that's also used for a lot of higher end stuff. So I think if this is something you would probably do more than once, then maybe invest in I think it's $40 or $50. But, if you really only need it to flash once or twice, maybe just hook up with somebody that already has one and float them a few bucks to do it. And you also asked, could the same programmer be used to debug an OSSC? I honestly have no idea. That's a good question. That's something you might want to ask in the OSSC forum on Shmups, but I'll leave a link to that for you as well. It's a Serial Wow had two questions. I'm going to answer the second one first because it's easier. For the NeoGeo Mini, has anyone attempted to reroute the pixel-perfect 4:3 video output of the LCD screen to an external source to bypass the terrible HDMI output? Well, it's definitely possible. Stuff like that, depending on what they use, LVDS to HDMI or something like that. But you're still really talking about an emulation console. So if you were interested in the NeoGeo Mini because you thought it would be cool to have a mini NeoGeo cabinet, I'd still get it. But if you were really looking for a cool official emulation solution, you might actually do better with a Raspberry Pi, or if we are all lucky, Furtek might be able to pull off getting his NeoGeo FPGA cores running on the Mister. Even if he doesn't, I'm strongly rooting for him to build his own FPGA NeoGeo, because it'll be zero lag. I would assume at least as accurate as emulation, if not perfect. And then you have a lot more options: direct analog out, HDMI, and any resolution up to 1080p, correctly scaled. If you were looking to do things like filters, CRT filters, definitely stick with a Raspberry Pi solution. For me personally, I like either the RGB Pi or the RetroTink. The RGB Pi is awesome, but it boots each game, or at least for arcades and NeoGeo, in its original resolution and refresh rate, which is perfect for PVMs. But if you have monitors that are a little finicky, the RetroTink regenerates the sync in a way that it's compatible with everything, pretty much. And the first question was a bit more complicated, and I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer for you. It sounds to me like you're using a consumer-grade CRT with SCART inputs, and some consoles display perfectly centered, and others are shifted a little bit over, and some way over, like the Saturn. And even the same console with two different outputs might be processed differently. So my first suggestion would be, if there's any sync strippers at all on the chain, either turn them off or bypass them somehow and see if that's what's affecting it. But other than that, I really don't know anything about PAL TVs with SCART inputs. That's not really a problem I've had on in any scenario in which I've tested. So I got nothing. I'm sorry. I wish I had some more advice to give. That's something that you might want to ask in the forums, and definitely put things like the model number of your TV, if you have any other devices that you could test on in comparison, especially if you have an RGB monitor or something. But you know, and if you want to post that extra info here, I'll try my best to look into it for you. But I don't really have access to any PAL CRTs with SCART inputs. I have one here that's a Brian Vega Algal TV, and it accepts NTSC and PAL over SCART, and everything looks perfect on it that I've tried. So yeah, I'm really not sure what advice I can give, but maybe grab more details, post here, post on some forums, and we'll see what we can do. The importer asked, has Kevtris or anyone else ever mentioned if a consoleized FPGA Game Boy Advance could be possible? So the direct answer to your question is everybody thinks that would be really hard and far off. However, a consoleized FPGA Game Boy is certainly possible. Kevtris hasn't specifically mentioned that, but it's you know, there's no reason why it couldn't be made. It might just be expensive. And the testing and development involved to spin off an FPGA core to an ASIC and include that would have to really demand quite a large volume in order to make that you know, monetarily feasible. But as far as an FPGA Game Boy Advance core, a lot of the people that I've spoke to about that said it would be very, very complicated, and it's possible, but I mean that would be an even bigger project than the Super Nintendo, I think. So I wouldn't hold your breath for any of those, but it's a good idea. It's one that I certainly think would be cool, especially if you could have you know, find a panel that you could do an integer scale of the original Game Boy into it, so you don't have to have a one-to-one. Or I guess you could even use the you know, the AGS 101 screens, but either way, I think it would be pretty cool. Adam W. was asking about the analog adapter for the Super NT and the Mega SG, and he had some pretty cool ideas speculating as to why it might be delayed, but I'm pretty sure it's just simply that Kevtris is the only developer, or the only developer working on the FPGA stuff, so he had to take a time out from that to work on the Mega SG, and now that that's finishing up, he can go back and finish off the other stuff. That's certainly not the path I would have chose. I would have, you know, had somebody else help or have him finish that before moving on to the other thing. But, you know, I think we've all seen how awesome the marketing team at Analog is. So whatever the reasonings for it, you know, it's got to be a good reason. So I'm pretty sure the only delay is just that Kevtris is only one person, and it will come out soon enough. Cesar Montes was asking about Dreamcast video outputs. And I'm going to try to make this short because I have a few videos about the Dreamcast coming up that will talk about all of this stuff in detail. But basically, he was thinking about swapping out the Acura for a Toro, so the HDMI box for the SCART VGA box, so that he could make better use of his existing analog solution that runs through good upscalers. And my suggestion is to do exactly that. There's nothing wrong with the Acura, but it is just simply an analog to digital converter. And that's not an insult, that's exactly what the Behar brothers had advertised it as. But if you already have an OSSC, that is a much, much better analog to digital converter. You know, it's 3 times the price, as it should be. But that'll do things like if you tweak it, you can get the aspect ratio perfect. You could double it to 960p if you'd like. There's just a lot of cool things to do. I would recommend using SCART simply because you could utilize the low-pass filters that are on the SCART input that are not on the VGA input, and just get a decent quality SCART cable. I like the Toro a lot. There's also a cable from the Foo that I started testing that so far seems good. I haven't spent enough time with it to give a definitive answer as to what, as to which is better, but I've used the Toro for years. And the only negative thing about the Toro is the little pigtail. Well, it's the same with the Acura, so you already know this, but it's a short little pigtail in the box behind it, so you can't really tweak that pigtail adapter or it'll eventually break. So just be careful with that. But yeah, I really think that's a better solution because you already own an OSSC. If you didn't, you know, unless the Dreamcast was your absolute favorite console, I wouldn't say sell the Akura, then go buy an OSSC and a Toro. But since you already have it, yeah, absolutely. And you should be able to sell it for almost as much as what a Toro is. But yeah, good thoughts, and you know, good luck with it. Well, that's about it for this week's Q&A. Sorry if I was a little loopy or anything. I landed this morning from the red-eye flight, went home, shower, and just been puttering about ever since. So, you know, hopefully this all made sense and wasn't shitty. But if any newcomers want to have any questions for next week, please remember to post down below on the Patreon Q&A page, the one that this video will be embedded in, and not in the YouTube video itself. This is something that gets shared with everybody about a month after it airs to Patreons, but it is a Patreon-focused thing. So please post any questions you have down below. I certainly love hearing from you. And thanks again, as always, for all of your support. I'll see you next week.